The faint light of dawn was barely breaking over the Isle of the Crown as Nightmare landed upon the beach. It had come at Samhain's bidding to return my prince and Princess Casima's parents once again to the lands of life. Alexander slipped from the winged creature's back, but the king and queen did not. "Aren't you coming?" Alexander asked. "Alhazred's treachery has eaten deep into the fabric of all we of the land of the Green Isles hold dear," King Caliphem said. "To defeat him will be more than the work of a single battle. Queen Alaria and I go now to do our part, Prince Alexander. Protect our dear Casima until we return." Nightmare bounded into the sky, and Alexander watched after the creature until she had vanished into the rising sun. Casima was to wed the murderous Alhazred that very day, and much needed to be done if he were to prevent the wedding from taking place. The prince thought very carefully over what he must do in the next few hours. He was certain he had a way into the castle that could not be stopped, but it would do him very little good if the guard dogs were alerted to watch for him. Alexander also had to convince Alhazred he was no longer a threat, enter the palace, reach Casima, and somehow delay the ceremony until King Caliphem's preparations were in place. All this before a breakfast that had been long delayed indeed. Frowning faintly in concentration, Alexander searched through his pack until he found what he needed. Assuring himself of their readiness, he walked to the crossroads and the oak. Sing Sing was still nestled in the branches, singing as if her heart would break. For what he knew to be the last time, Prince Alexander of Daventry stopped before the tree. He held out the white rose from the beast's garden to the little bird. "Sing Sing, take this to Casima for me. I wish you could tell her how much I've come to love her," Alexander added, as the bird plucked the creamy blossom from his hand. And though he waited longer than he had either of the other occasions, this time Sing Sing did not return. Alexander had no way of knowing whether Casima had received the flower, or even if the little nightingale were safe. He shook his head. He could wait no longer. The sun was already high in the sky, and there was much to accomplish before noon. In the village square, he received the first hint that luck favored him at last. The old lamp seller was there again, crying his wares to all who would listen. Taking the old, and by now rather scorched and battered, brass lamp out of his pack, Alexander approached the old man. "Good morning, grandfather. Will you take this old lamp and give me a new one in exchange?" "Of course," the old man said delightedly, taking the hunter's lamp from Alexander. "That's what I'm here for. Choose anything you find in my stock." Alexander studied the old man's wares carefully. He needed a lamp that would look enough like the genie's lamp for Jolo to substitute the fake for the real. But Alexander had never seen the genie's lamp. Or had he? Alexander cast his mind back to that first painful interview with Abdul Alhazred. There had been a lamp in that room. Surely Alhazred would keep that which allowed him to control the genie with him at all times. He remembered its color as blue. Alexander strove to recall its shape. In the end, his hopes of victory came down to a reasoned guess. If not a great magician, Alexander is still a well-read scholar of magic. Descriptions of gin and their bottles are widespread throughout Daventry. He remembered Jolo's words and chose a slender blue bottle with a broad, fat base. "I'll take this one, good sir, and thanks," Alexander said. A giddy sense of relief, or perhaps terror, overcame him. He had made his irrevocable choice. He placed the bottle carefully into his pack, took a deep breath, and walked into the pawn shop. As Alexander had hoped, the black-robed old man, whom the prince knew to be Alhazred's genie, was still looking about. Alexander ignored all of Hakim's attempts to warn him away, and innocently asked if the shopkeeper would exchange his tinderbox for an artist's brush. Hoping to get rid of him quickly for his own safety, Hakim all but thrust the brush into Alexander's hands. "Now go!" he hissed. But Alexander was not yet finished with the genie. I would be less than honest if I do not admit the admiration of the large streak of, shall we say, misdirection in Prince Alexander's nature. It is due, no doubt, to his difficult upbringing as a slave boy in Manannan's house, where forthright honesty, if practiced, would certainly not count helpful for survival. This is not to imply that Alexander is actually dishonest, merely that, though Alexander is the kindest and most tender-hearted of princes, he is not above a bit of tactful chicanery when he thinks it may be the shortest, not to mention best route to his goal. He does it well. A certain amount of acting ability was another thing Alexander had found use for survival during his boyhood. My prince walked to the center of the pawn shop and made certain that the genie was watching him. Then he pulled out the small drink-me bottle and flourished it dramatically, careful to keep the genie from getting too near a look at it. "Hakim, I can endure no longer. Without Cassima, I have no desire to live," Alexander shouted. "I shall take poison!" He quickly unstoppered the empty green bottle and pretended to drink its contents, grasped his stomach as if in pain, then collapsed limply on the floor. He lay there motionless and not breathing, apparently lifeless. The pawnbroker rushed forward and placed his ear to Alexander's chest. "Is he dead?" the genie asked coldly. Alexander continued, holding his breath. "Yes," Hakim said firmly, squeezing Alexander's shoulder in acknowledgement of the ruse. Breath held to bursting, eyes tightly closed, Alexander heard departing footsteps, and the door to the shop open, then slammed closed. The genie's cries of rejoicing faded into the distance outside. Filling his lungs with a gasp, Alexander sat up and stared right into the startled eyes of the pawnbroker. "But why?" Hakim asked. "So that reports of my death will be somewhat exaggerated, I hope," Alexander said with the ghost of a grin. "Look, Hakim, I must go to the castle and try to stop the wedding. Alhazred won't be looking for me if he thinks I'm dead. He murdered Cassima's parents, the king and queen, and must be stopped before he does worse than he has already." "As you wish. May fortune attend you, young sir," Hakim said sadly. "But I think you are a fool." Of course, Hakim could be right, Alexander thought as he headed to the Castle of the Crown. The next few hours would determine his fate, not only of Cassima, but of all the folk of the land of the Green Isles that Alexander had grown to know over the last 3 days. Alexander knew that this was the worst possible time for self-doubt, no matter how reasonable it seemed, and he sternly banished it from his mind. If he failed, he would have eternity on the Isle of the Dead to contemplate might-have-beens. Alexander approached the castle warily, but did not this time walk up to the front door. He slipped westward, down a path that led along the side of the castle wall, taking care at all times to stay out of sight of the guard dogs that warded the castle's main portal. Once he reached his goal, a blank, featureless expanse of creamy alabaster greeted him. Alexander set down his pack, took out his spell book, and turned to the magic paint spell. The combination swamp ooze mixed with Styx water paste was still clinging inside its teacup. The moment he touched the stuff with Nightmare's feather, however, it instantly turned to mud and water again. He stirred them together thoroughly and soaked his paintbrush full of the sorceress decoction. Before the solution had time to solidify again, Alexander painted the shape of a door on the pristine white wall, and while the image was still wet, he chanted the paint spell. The door became as if real. The spell had worked. Without hesitation, Alexander opened the door and silently crept into the Castle of the Crown. The only other time Alexander had been inside the castle, he had come in through the front door under Captain Saladin's escort. This time, he had entered on the lowest level of the palace. Directly before him were doors that probably, in any castle run by Alhazred, led to grim dungeon cells. To his left must be the guard room, for the guard dog's gruff growling when it echoed down the halls. In these last hours before the wedding, the castle would be well patrolled, even if Alhazred wasn't expecting a visit from a dead Alexander of Daventry. Alexander knew he must be very careful in the halls. One false step would mean his capture, if not his death. Silently, he headed up the hallway, and heard the sound of guard dogs marching his way. At once he doubled back. The magic door had already vanished, but the cell doors across the hall were unlocked. He quickly slipped into the center cell and listened. The sounds of the guard dogs patrolling the hall outside rang, but no suspicions filled the ordinary, if somewhat lewd, banter. Then they faded. Then, from behind him, Alexander became aware of the sound of childish weeping. He turned, and on the dungeon cot was the huddled figure of a ghostly little boy. His age could have been no more than 4 or 5 summers. "I'm lost," he sobbed. "Oh, where is my mother? How will I find her? I'm lost! I'm lost!" "Little boy," Alexander called softly, trying to think of some way to comfort the spirit. He held out the faint handkerchief he had carried from the Isle of the Dead. The boy took it from him and blew his nose several times. It helped him regain some lost poise. "I'm Alexander of Daventry, and I'm looking for Princess Cosima. Do you know her? Can you help me find her?" The boy's sobbing had stopped. He wiped his face with the handkerchief and looked at Alexander. "The bad man has locked her in her room," the little ghost replied. "There's a secret passage behind the old armor by the guard room. You can work it by pulling its arm. Sometimes the bad man is there and spies on Cosima because she's so pretty. I've tried to scare him, but he doesn't see me." The boy began to sob again. "You leave Alhazred to me," Alexander said gently. The little boy took the ethereal handkerchief and wiped his eyes again. "His handkerchief! It's hers!" he said suddenly. "It's my mother's! I know how to find her now! Oh, thank you, Prince Alex!" The boy clutched the handkerchief in his hand and slowly vanished away before Alexander's eyes. Even at such a time as this, he spared a moment to hope that the child ghost had made it safely to the land of the dead, if that could indeed be a happy conclusion for a spirit such as his. So there's a secret passage, and a way to spy on Cosima. Not too surprising, but I think I can put it to a better use than Alhazred does. Once I've seen Jolo first, if I can discover him. Easing slowly out of the dungeon cell, Alexander went in search of the court clown. The armor that concealed the secret passage was at the end of the hall, but Alexander did not stop to try it. He continued by it, following the hallway around still another corner, and taking care to avoid new patrols all the way. The door he eventually came to was grander than the cell doors, and grander than the door to the guard dog's guard room, but not so grand as the door to the vizier's study, where Alexander had once been interviewed by Alhazred. Cautiously, Alexander tried the door and entered. Once more, he found Dame Fortune sitting upon his shoulder. He also found Jolo sitting listlessly at a table, turning the pages of an old joke book and sighing deeply. "Come now, Jolo, is that any way to be acting when there's work to be done?" Alexander said. Jolo started in astonishment. "Prince Alexander! How did you get into the castle? How did you find me? I thought you were dead. That is, the vizier told me—" "Never mind that now. I told you we would meet again. Do you think this lamp is close enough to the genie's for you to make a swap?" Alexander held out the one he had obtained from the old lamp seller. Jolo took it and turned it over and over in his hands. I guess so, Prince Alexander. And for Casima's sake, I'll try. Good, said Alexander. Exchange them as soon as you can. I'll see what I can do to make Alhazred's wedding day a day he'd rather forget. Jolo favored Alexander with a rather worried smile and got to his feet. Good luck then, Prince Alexander, and may we meet next in happier circumstances. They clasped hands warmly, and then the clown left the room, the lamp concealed beneath his vest. After a moment, Alexander followed. My prince retraced his steps to the suit of armor, placed his hand on the steel arm, and tugged. Without a creak, a section of wall fell away, revealing the secret doorway. A cautious glance around, and Alexander ducked inside. One wall of the secret passage had the guard room on its other side. There was a slitted gap in that wall large enough to peek through and not be seen. Alexander looked inside, and he could see some of the guard dogs sitting around a table, deep in talk. It's too bad that Alexander person turned out to be a spy, one said. He smelled like a nice enough young man. You can never tell, Grolf, a second answered. The vizier said he was an enemy, and that's enough for me. You mean Captain Saladin said he was an enemy. Captain Saladin is always right, Howell. And sometimes the vizier is rather strange. Why, just the other day I saw him talking to the wall near the treasure room. You mean the door in the west corridor that's always locked? Howell asked. Exactly. He said Ali, but when he saw me overhearing him, he stopped like he was in mid-word. Well, it's not for the likes of us to be spying on the likes of him, Howell said firmly. And I have better things to do than spy on the likes of you, Alexander said to himself. He backed away silently from the spy hole and turned to a set of stairs leading up. Taking care to avoid creaking boards, he ascended to the next floor. On the second floor, what would be the first floor of the castle if Alexander were in the halls and not in the walls, he paused a moment to gain his bearings and then turned down the corridor. The prince felt very much as if he were back in the catacombs beneath the aisle of the sacred mountain, with its twisting, turning, dusty passageways. When he reached the end of the first hall, he turned into the next. Alexander thought he must now be behind the vizier's study, the room to which he had been first brought when he had washed up on the Isle of the Crown. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but Alexander knew it had only been 3 days. Here, Alexander moved more slowly, looking carefully for more holes in the plaster wall. His patience was soon rewarded. Alexander placed his eye to a new peephole, peered through, and for the second time in his life, looked upon the murderous Abdul Alhazred, vizier of the Isle of the Crown, minion of Mordak, murderer of Casima's parents, jailer of Casima, and sower of dissension among all the land of the Green Isles. Alhazred was writing a letter. He wrote slowly, pausing to read choice passages out loud as he went. My dear Shadrach, salutations from a fellow member of the Society of the Black Cloak. Our plans are about to come to fruition. By the time you read this, I shall have wed the Princess Casima, and become a grieving widower as well. It is a shame that Casima must die, but the people are loyal to her, and I have been unable to gain her trust. Knowing your peculiar interests, I wish I could make you a present of her, either dead or alive. But as you know, when I presented her to Mordak, he was slain, and she was back here within the year. I will not allow that to happen again. Alhazred scribbled a few more lines, then sanded and sealed the scroll. Taking up his own black cloak, which in the light of the letter assumed for Alexander a dire significance, Alhazred walked out the door, humming a lilting tune. The vizier's scheme was now murderously clear to Prince Alexander. Alhazred meant to kill Casima, just as he had her parents. There could be no time to lose. Even if King Calaphine brought the allies he had promised Alexander, it might be too late for Casima. He must reach her and see her again, even at the risk of his own life. But secret passages imply secret doors, and for the next few minutes, Alexander searched frantically along the wall. A few yards beyond the spy hole, he discovered the concealed door he had been probing for. Cautiously, he opened it. The doorway seemed to be full of musty clothes, but a moment later, Alexander realized he was in a wardrobe, surrounded by silken robes, unclean hose, and strong perfumes. He groped around until he found the latch, and stepped out into Alhazred's empty bedroom. Although Alexander knew the truth about the Alhazred and the death of Casima's parents, to convince others would require more proof than his word alone. He searched the room quickly. First, he looked into the small brass-bound ebony chest, but the only thing he found of interest there was a slip of parchment with the word Zebu on it. It meant nothing, unless it was part of the magic word which opened the treasure room door. Taking the parchment, he turned to the brass-bound chest at the foot of Alhazred's bed. It was locked, but remember, Alexander had come prepared with a genuine skeleton key. As mentioned earlier in this slight chronicle, such things always find a use. A moment later, he had the trunk open. It was filled with documents, and Alexander picked up the top one. His eyes widened as he read a new letter. To Alhazred, a brother of the Black Cloak, from Shadrach, also of that company. Greetings. I am sorry to hear of Mordak's death, but you seem to have the destruction of the kingdom well in hand. Turning the islands against one another and eliminating the king and queen is a stratagem worthy of even me. Do as I advise with that meddling brat Casima, and the crown surely shall be yours. It was signed Shade, and most likely Shadrach's hidden name for himself. Proof indeed. With this document, Alexander was certain he could gain aid against Alhazred. He hastily tucked the letter into his tunic, ducked back into the wardrobe, and followed his footsteps back through the dust of the passage until he reached the stairs once more. This time, the sound of weeping echoed softly through the chamber, a weeping that was far from ghostly. Alexander found a narrow crack in the wall that he had overlooked before and peeked through. A woman sat erect and elegant on a downy bed, staring through a tall window overlooking the island. Her head turned briefly toward the wall Alexander was concealed behind. The tears were as real as she. It was Casima. Alexander tells me that no matter what poets might say about a young man's feelings upon catching sight of his beloved, what he felt most at that time was sheer panic. According to Alhazred, Casima was due to have a fatal accident rather soon after the wedding ceremony, and Alexander knew that that was set to begin almost any moment. Casima, he whispered urgently. Casima, it's me, Alexander. The words so startled the imprisoned princess that she shrank back in startlement for a moment. Then she looked around, unbelieving, stood up, and rushed to the wall. The prince's voice directed her to the peephole. Alexander? Oh, it is you! But what are you doing here? How did you get here? You're in such danger! Casima's voice trembled on the verge of tears. Not as much as you are, Alexander retorted. Alhazred has been plotting to take over the kingdom from the very start. He's in league with someone named Shade. And as you suspected, he was even behind your kidnapping by Mordak. Look at this! Alexander passed Shadrach's letter to the princess through the crack in the wall. She read it, blanched, and then handed it back. Saladin must see this, she said urgently. He would not keep me prisoner here if he knew. You must take it to him, Alexander, at once! The first thing I must do is get you out of here, Alexander began, but Casima shushed him. If I vanish, Alhazred will tear the entire castle apart looking for me. He would find you, dear Alexander, and I cannot bear to think of what you would suffer at his hands. No, leave me here. I will be safe for a while. I only wish I had some way to defend myself. Alexander barely registered the endearment from Casima's lips. Instead, he was groping for the dagger Celeste had given him. Finding it, he forced the elegant, deadly thing through the gap in the wall and into the princess's hands. Take this, he said. I hope that you will not need it. Cosima smiled and tucked the dagger into her robes. New tears moistened her eyes. Of joy, or sadness, or hope, or despair, Alexander could not determine. And the matter is too delicate for me to inquire of Cosima about now. It remains a secret between her and her lover. That is as it should be. Now go, Cosima urged. You have tarried here too long already. Alexander had to agree. Impulsively reaching to each other through the crack, they touched fingertips together for the briefest of eternities, each knowing that it might be their only kiss, neither daring to say any more to the other. In the place Alhazred had spied unseen upon Cosima's private moments, they came together and parted. Alexander quickly made his way down the steps and slipped out of the secret passage to the hall. He tried to force his mind away from the unbearable thought that this brief moment with Cosima might be his only one. Would either of them survive the next hours? In the castle's hallway once more, Alexander continued straight, keeping an eye out for roving patrols. Just by the place he had entered through a magic door, he discovered a real door in the wall, one without knob or lock. This must be Alhazred's secret treasure room, the one spoken of by the guards. If the genie's bottle were being kept secure there, Jolo would have been unable to make the switch. At that very instant, wedding music began playing in the halls above. Alexander gritted his teeth, but stayed where he was. He had to discover if the genie's bottle was inside. "Door!" he whispered urgently. "Open! Door!" Nothing happened. "Door! Open up!" Again, nothing. He tried the magic word. "Zebu Ali! Zebu Ali!" Again, the door spurned him. There was one last chance. "Door! Ali Zebu! Ali Zebu!" The door had indeed been locked by words of power. When my prince finally spoke the magic sounds in the proper order, it grudgingly swung open. Heedless of discovery at this late moment, Alexander rushed inside. Alexander found himself in a treasure room indeed. What looked like the entire royal treasury of the Isle of the Crown was piled about the walls of the small room. The genie's bottle, however, was nowhere in sight, to Alexander's relief. But when he removed the coverlet that lay draped upon a low table in the center of the room, he saw the lost treasures of all the lands of the Green Isles. He looked quickly at each: the tiny oak tree of the Druids, the fleece made of pure gold stolen from the Winged Ones, the fabulously ornate jeweled coat of arms on the Isle of the Crown, and the large crystalline singstone of the Isle of Wonders. They were all truly priceless, but how had they come to be where they were? A particularly loud skirl of music gained Alexander's attention. He could do nothing more where he was. Clutching Shadrach's letter in his hand, Alexander left the treasure room and hurried to the archway across the hall from Jolo's room. He climbed the stairs he found there. They led to the grand hall. "Well, this is for Cosima," Alexander consoled himself as he stepped through the door. Taking a deep breath, he started toward the set of doors that led to the throne room, where the wedding was taking place. Suddenly, the great ceremonial doors burst open from within, and the commander of the guard dogs came rushing toward him, a sword pointed at Alexander's guts. "Fool!" Saladin growled as he came near the prince. "I did not think you were dead, but a wise man would have stayed far away from here on this day." "Captain Saladin," Alexander said, "you can't let that wedding take place. Alhazred is a murderer. He killed the king and queen, and I have proof." Alexander thrust the scroll toward the captain of the guard. Saladin read the parchment, his lip lifting to show sharp white teeth, but his sword never wavering as it touched Alexander's stomach. "Prince Alexander, your recent misfortunes must have addled your wits if you think this poor forgery proves anything. Even now the Princess Cosima goes freely to her wedding with the vizier. Come quietly, and you will see for yourself before you die." "That can't be!" Alexander was stunned. He had counted on Cosima delaying the wedding until her parents could return. Even if she did not know of their arrival, she certainly did not wish to marry Alhazred. Numbly, Alexander allowed himself to be led into the throne room. The throne room of the Castle of the Crown is gigantic, although then it was sparsely filled for a royal wedding. To Alexander's stunned horror, he saw Cosima standing next to the vizier, her hand on his arm, looking perfectly at ease, calm, tearless, and smiling. "You see?" rumbled Saladin pityingly. Alexander stared fixedly at the form of his beloved, willing her before his death to answer the only question that mattered. Then Cosima looked up, and her eyes flashed gold. "That's not Cosima!" Alexander shouted, lunging forward. Saladin yanked him back. "Who dares to disrupt this joyous occasion?" Alhazred snarled. He spun around and saw Alexander. "You!" He turned to Cosima. "You told me he was dead, blast you! And you!" Alhazred pointed to Captain Saladin. "You'll pay for this incompetence! I told you to throw this dog in the dungeon if you caught him, not invite him to the wedding!" "There will be no wedding," a new voice commanded. And Alexander looked behind him, and every eye present followed. Into the throne room marched King Caliphium and Queen Ilaria, surrounded by a guard of druid sorcerers and soldiers from all of the other isles. "It's the king and queen! They're alive!" The gasp of astonishment seemed to come from everywhere at once, and even the multiverse itself seemed to pause, as if sharing the emotion. Then everything dissolved, if not into chaos, then at least into total confusion. The guard dogs fell to their knees, releasing Alexander as they did. The queen rushed past them all, thinking of only embracing her beloved Cosima once more. But when she reached her daughter's side, Ilaria stopped. "That isn't my daughter!" she exclaimed in horror. Cosima's form began to shimmer. "What have you done with our daughter?" the king demanded. Beside the wicked vizier now stood not Cosima, but the genie who served him. "Shamir, defend me!" shouted Alhazred to his minion. Behind a dazzling hail of magic spells flung at once by the genie, Alhazred ran for the door, leading to the tower behind the throne room. Alexander followed instants behind. My prince paused on the first landing. Above him, he heard Alhazred's footsteps echo upward. Below him, he could hear the pandemonium in the throne room. But where was Cosima, the true Cosima? Alexander again dashed up after the vizier. At the end, Alexander found himself in a tower that stretched the height of the palace. Sprinting up flights of curving stairs beyond the rogue vizier, Alexander emerged in the topmost room of that tower. A black-haired woman, Cosima herself, lay bound and helpless on the floor, Alhazred standing over her menacingly with a sword. She was struggling with her bonds, and Alexander saw a brief flash of a dagger cutting a rope. Just as Alexander was about to go to her, the genie appeared in a great flash and cloud in front of him, grinning from a kill. His way to Cosima was blocked. "You may have thwarted my plans to rule here, Alexander of Daventry," the Abdul Alhazred spat, "but that's the last thing you're ever going to ruin. First, you're going to watch your pretty little princess chopped to pieces." The vizier snarled, raised the sword in his hands, and stepped toward Cosima. "Prince Alexander, catch!" Alexander spun around. It was Jolo the clown, standing atop the steps, holding a blue glass bottle. As soon as Alexander turned, Jolo flung it at him. In a single motion, Alexander caught the bottle and held it up before the genie. "Look, this is your bottle, genie. I am now your master, and as your master, I command you into the bottle at once." There was no pause or hesitation. There could not be. Shamir the genie vanished, leaving only a wisp of smoke behind on the emotion-charged air. Alexander flung the genie-filled bottle back to Jolo. Alhazred hesitated. My prince jumped forward and grabbed a ceremonial sword from the wall. The vizier turned his attention from Cosima. and Alexander turned just in time to defend himself from Alhazred's first deadly lunge. Swordplay has never been a large part of Alexander's education, either as the slave boy Gwydion or as the rediscovered Prince Alexander. King Graham believes there are better ways than force to resolve most problems, and Alexander never had the heart to fully learn the discipline of the blade. Alhazred was much the better swordsman, and the ceremonial sword my prince wielded had neither true edge nor point. Alhazred would surely have killed Alexander long before anyone could come to his rescue. But my prince did not struggle alone. Princess Cosima is not the sort who leaves others to fight her battles, nor to shirk one either. Working desperately with the dagger Alexander had given her, Cosima was able to free herself from the ropes which bound her. With an avenging shout, the princess attacked Alhazred from behind, drawing blood in some small recompense for all that Alhazred had shed. The damage Cosima did was not critical, but it hurt Alhazred sufficiently for Alexander to put his borrowed sword to its best possible use, smashing the vizier over the head with it. As Alhazred slumped unconscious to the floor, a pair of guards, whiskers bristling, dashed into the room. Too late to help, they looked upon the battle's aftermath and the bloody, unconscious former vizier. "This one will grace our dungeons for a very long time," Gralf promised triumphantly as he and Howell dragged Alhazred away. Jolo, seeing that only the prince and the princess remained, discreetly followed. Then Alexander and Cosima were alone. She looked at Alexander, took a step forward, then quickly looked away, blushing. He too started to move forward, hesitated, and then crossed his hands at his waist and shuffled feet instead, unable to look the princess full in the eyes. "I'm sure we must all be very grateful for what you have done today, Alexander. All of the land of the Green Isles owes you a debt of gratitude we will never be able to repay," Cosima said. Her voice was very low, but even so, it trembled. "I don't want your gratitude, Cosima," Alexander stuttered. She looked at him in startlement. "Alexander has confided to me that what he did next required more courage than anything else he had done anywhere in the land of the Green Isles." "I want your love," Alexander said. "And I yours," was the princess's unhesitant reply. "Will you marry me, Cosima?" "Oh, Alexander, gladly." And so will it be. With the genie at her command, the Princess Cosima has already been able to right many of the wrongs Alhazred has done to her people. Shamir has repaired the ferry, and communication has been re-established among the islands. Once Alexander told the king and queen what he had found in the castle's treasure room, the return of the stolen treasures did much to smooth over any remaining hostility the islands might feel for one another, and for the inhabitants of the Isle of the Crown. The genie, disguised, had been the culprit all along, and with that revealed, there is little cause now for animosity. And it has even been said by the aid of Shamir that Cosima was able to transport Alexander's family, King Graham, Queen Valenice, and Princess Rosella, to witness today's joyous ceremony that will unite the land of the Green Isles and the kingdom of Daventry in marriage. At my prince's request, I too have been asked to become part of the celebration. And now I must lay my pen aside, for the hour grows short, and I am summoned to Alexander and Cosima's wedding. Joyous music peals out everywhere. Without the palace, crowds cheer without stopping. The tale that Alexander wishes me to relate ends here. No matter what future befalls Alexander and his bride, it is here that I must leave you. It is as it should be, for this is their day. May they live long in peace, prosperity, and in joy. And so concludes the 6th story in the King's Quest series, as told by the King's Quest Companion. Sadly, as of the recording of this final video, I still have not been able to obtain a copy of the 4th edition of this book, which of course includes the 7th story, The Princeless Bride. I do hope still to one day obtain that, although from what I have researched so far, obtaining a copy can be quite pricey, if copies are still even attainable at this time. If that day comes soon, then I shall relay you the 7th story and final story in the series. Until then, we will just wait and see what stories will follow next in future editions of Rowdy Reads. So until that day comes, as always, stay rowdy, my friends.